Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through my 10 favourite jazz big band albums. It's in a rough sort of order, but I gotta admit I have really cheated a little bit on this. Mostly in what I've defined a jazz big band to be. I've been pretty wide in my remit and definition of what a big band is, a jazz big band is. My dad was a huge big band fan when I was growing up. I listened to a lot of it when I was growing up. There's so much to choose from. I've actually gone through my record collection and I've just quickly pulled out some albums that I'm not including that I absolutely love and I sort of grew up with. And it does illustrate this idea of what do we class as big band jazz. You know, I mean, for a start, I haven't included Dizzy Gillespie's incredible big band from the 1940s. You know, bebop produced bebop big bands, and Dizzy's was probably the greatest of them all. Really important for bringing Afro-Cuban music into jazz. This is the album I grew up with, which is a compilation album called Strictly Bebop, and it features Dizzy's band with a very young John Coltrane on I think alto sax on here, but we've also got the Bab Gonzalez Orchestra and the Tad Dameron Orchestra, Tad Dameron being one of the great arrangers of bebop. But I haven't got that on the list. And then, what about all these fusion big bands? You know, what about this? This for me is one of the greatest Miles Davis albums from his late period. This is, for me, I think is the greatest one. And it's a huge orchestral tribute to Miles that was made by, who was the guy that put it together? I forgot. Paul Mickelborg. So it's like a European take. Really interesting album. If you can get past the Simmons electric drums on here, this is an incredible album. But is that a big band jazz album? What about things like this? Spike Jones. I love Spike Jones. You know, I got Spike Jones through Frank Zappa. And what Spike Jones did was sort of do these spoofy, big band, Charleston-y takes on all sorts of weird music. He was the weird Al Yankovic of his period. Incredible arrangements. I love Spike Jones, but is this big band jazz? And of course, being British, there's all those incredible British big bands, you know, it's like Ted Heath, with the incredible Ronnie Verrell on drums, the guy that went on to become Animal in the Muppets. This is a great album. And of course, for most people, if you said big band jazz to the person in the street, they're going to think of this, aren't they? Frank Sinatra with Nelson Riddle arrangements behind a swinging big band, you know. But I haven't put that on the list. And what about the kitschy, cheesy 1950s world of Les Baxter? You know, is that big band jazz? I love all of that. But I'm not going to be talking about that today. I'm going to be talking about my 10 favourites. This is entirely subjective. Alright, so all of you out there will say you missed this out. I'm going to be missing out a whole ton of really important big bands here. But this is my list. This is what I grew up loving. So I'm going to start at number 10 and work my way up. So at number 10 I have this incredible epic, which is the Jazz Composers Orchestra. Right, this is a free big band jazz album with some of the most incredible people from that genre. If you're not a fan of free jazz, you're not going to like this because this is pretty hardcore as well. It features a huge lineup, right? And it's almost like a concerto. Each lineup has a featured musician. So the first track on here, Communications number 8, has Don Cherry and Gato Barbieri. You know, Don Cherry, of course, the legend from Ornette Coleman, one of the pioneers of free jazz. And Gato Barbieri, of course, the guy behind the soundtrack to Last Tango in Paris, but an incredible free player. We've got a huge band here that features Steve Lacy, Gene Hall, Bob Donovan. We've got Reggie Workman on here, Andrew Cyril, Carla Blaze on here, Howard Johnson's on here, Jimmy Nepper's on here. It's an incredible lineup, and these tunes are free, but they're expansive and spacey. The other featured soloist on here on Communications number 9 is Larry Coryell. And Larry Coryell plays on here some of the most out there free jazz guitar you have ever heard. He goes beyond Sonny Sharrock, it's beyond Derek Bailey. There's an incredible photo in the album, if I can find it, where they took a photo of him actually doing the takes for his bit. I'll try and show you them. right? They're really tiny. But here's some photos, if it will focus on there, of Larry taking it. You can see he's like pushing the guitar into the amp, it's feeding back, his hat's flying off. This is a really incredible album. I've gone back to it over and over again. It's really, the guy behind it is Michael Mantler, that's also behind that masterpiece where is it? There, Escalator Over the Hill. And that's another album that nearly made the list. That's an incredible big band jazz album. Truly incredible. A triple disc concept album, which is just so mind-numbing, with such an incredible list of guests, including John McLaughlin, Don Cherry, Jack Bruce. An incredible album. And so is this. This is approach this album with caution, but this is one of my favourite big band jazz albums. Right, so number 9 on my list. Right, I could have picked a million albums by this guy, as he was so prolific, but this is the album that I had when I was growing up. You know, this is the album that I listened to loads, and this is the album I love, and it is Nothing Is by Sun Ra. Sun Ra is this incredible musician that goes right back to the beginnings of jazz. Coming up through that Fletcher Henderson school of jazz arrangement, he then went on to form his own big band, which again was like a free jazz big band, but it was much more beyond that. But for me, Sun Ra, he represents the beginning of jazz and the most avant-garde end of jazz in a way. His orchestra, and that's the only way to describe it, contains some of the greatest musicians in jazz history, all working for peanuts because they love this guy's music. Sun Ra, of course, would dress himself up and the band up in this sort of psychedelic Afro sci-fi space garb, and he would go around telling everybody that he was from Saturn. He had a whole mythology that went behind his music, which then went on to influence the likes of, you know, Parliament Funkadelic. This is an absolute giant. I've never mentioned him on the channel, but I absolutely love him. I've got an album from the 60s of his sort of electric keyboard experimentation. This guy was so far ahead, he really was. And this album is an absolute masterpiece. Some of his albums aren't that well recorded. This one's pretty good. I'm not saying it's brilliant, but it's pretty good. For me, growing up, the thing that blew me away was John Gilmour's sax playing on here. The lineup on here is John Gilmour, tenor sax, Marshall Allen, alto sax, the absolute legend, Pat Patrick on baritone sax, another legend. We've also got Robert Cummings, Teddy Nance, Ali Hassan, Clifford Jarvis on drums, one of the great jazz drummers of all time. We've got Ronnie Boykins on bass and tuba, James Jackson on log drum and flute, and Carl Nimrod on sun horn. You can't really make an album without having a bit of sun horn on there, can you? And of course, if you're going to have sun horn on your album, the go-to guy is Carl Nimrod. You've learned something on this channel. John Gilmour is astonishing on here, and if you plot John Coltrane's progression through, there's a point where he hears John Gilmour and he takes so much from that guy. And when you check out here, it's like Coltrane times 10. This is a monster album. So if you want to try and dig something out to introduce yourself to Sun Ra, which again is a difficult listen, then that's the one for you. Right, what have I got at number 7? I grew up listening to this album, and it is Kenton at the Tropicana with Stan Kenton and his orchestra. Right, Stan Kenton, a troublesome figure in the history of jazz, I think. So Stan Kenton was born around about 1911. Right, I'm not too sure because you know how I do my videos. It's all off the top of my head. It's either 1913 or 1911. So he's literally 10 years younger than Louis Armstrong. So he's coming to fruition as a musician in the 20s and 30s. So he's another guy that goes right back to the beginnings of jazz. In the 1940s, he forms this big band. And when we say big band, it's a big band. He expands the palette of big bands. Now, this is at a time where the big band is actually dying away. Once bebop came in, a lot of the big band musicians joined the army, and the gigs weren't there. The big band started to shrink. Dizzy Gillespie was important in keeping going, but Stan Kenton came out with this huge expanded band with tubas and all sorts of extra instruments, a really powerful band. And he started to apply almost like classical approaches and arrangements to the big band jazz genre. Quite avant-garde. He was pushing the envelope. This became known as progressive jazz. So all you prog rock fans who have plucked up the courage to watch one of my jazz videos, this guy is the prog of jazz. I can't believe it. I bet you this is my mom. I bet you any money it's my mom. Yes. Hello, Mom. Can I call you back in a bit?
Yeah. Oh, did you ring me earlier?
Yeah, I'll call you back in a minute because I'm doing a video. All right.
All right. Yeah.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
I would switch my phone off, but it annoys people. One guy got really annoyed on a video the other day because I answered my phone, and I quite like it when the phone goes off because it proves that I am going for this for real. You know, we're going for it, and the world out there is trying to impinge, but we bash it. That's my mom. I've just told my mom to go away so we could talk about Stan Kenton. Right? So, Kenton comes out with this sort of basically progressive jazz, which then became known as third stream. A lot of the musicians are really incredible musicians coming through his band, and this is highly influential. But what's more important with Kenton, it was massively successful. He would do concerts where he sold the Hollywood Bowl out, and he was pulling in about $1 million a year back then, which is equivalent to about $10 million now. This guy was a superstar. Here in the UK, had a huge following. This was popular, experimental, avant-garde jazz at the time, right? His band went on, and because of the complex subjects he was dealing with, he decided to set up an educational sort of part of his band, and he would go into colleges and schools. And Kenton was really important for the development of jazz education in America, and his education program produced a whole ton of musicians. But the critics really didn't like him. That you get the same sort of snotty reaction that Prog got in the 70s. Well, Kenton had the same thing, but on top of that, he did have a drink problem, and his daughter came out saying that she'd received abuse from him. So this is a very divisive character, and what's happened, I think, historically, he just doesn't really get talked about. But if you step back objectively and look at it, this guy is one of the giants of jazz history. And so this album is a really good representation of him. I'm not saying it's his best album, it's the one I grew up with. It's got his famous track Artistry and Rhythm on here, so it's got Bernie's tune, his version of Tuxedo Junction. It's a good place to start for Kenton. So that's what I got at number 7, is Stan Kenton. Right, so at number 6, I've got a very personal choice. You know, I came to fruition as a musician in the 1980s. And as I was moving from heavy metal, classic rock, prog rock to jazz, there was actually an explosion in the UK of jazz. We suddenly had this new jazz scene, really heralded by the likes of Courtney Pine and Julian Joseph. And that was incredible because suddenly there was jazz on the TV. There was even jazz on the charts. You know, I then, as a British person, could go and see these groups. And there was a drummer called Mark Mondesir who drummed for Courtney Pine, who was incredibly important in my development because I could actually go and see this live. But on the other side, there was another group that was also really, really important because it contained the sort of cream of the British jazz scene at that time. And that group was Loose Tubes, and this is their debut album. And I absolutely love this album, listening to it to death. And it really has, there's the Loose Tubes there. It really has some of the great British jazz players on here. The guy behind this, I think, really was Django Bates. And Django Bates is almost like a cross between Gil Evans and Frank Zappa, but channeled through a sort of British English aesthetic. I absolutely love Django Bates. But we got some incredible musicians here from the British jazz scene. Ian Bellamy on sax, Steve Buckley, Tim Whitehead, Mike Lockhart, Dave Bitelli, Di Pritchard, Eddie Parker, Dave DeFries, John Eacott, Chris Batchelor, Lance Kelly, John Harborne, Steve Day, Richard Bywell, Ashley Slater on trombone, who then goes on to have a #1 in the acid jazz scene a few years later. We got Dave Powell on tuba, Django Bates on keyboards, John Paricelli on electric guitar, Steve Berry on bass, the great Nick France on drums, and on percussion Steve Arguales, who's also an incredible drummer, and Colin Lazari on bass, telephone, typewriter and rabbit. See, these big band albums, you have to get the right people on there to play the right things. And, you know, if you're not going to use a sun horn on your album, then you better use a rabbit. It's a very English, very English approach there to big band jazz. One more thing I got to say, the drummer on this, Nick France, he appeared in 1980 on a TV programme here in the UK where he was pitted against the drummer from Shakin' Stevens bands, I believe, and they sort of had this sort of drum lesson clinic with Billy Cobham. You know, I think within 2 weeks of me starting drums, that was on the TV, and I videotaped that, and that was my Bible on how to drum. So in a way, Nick France was a huge, huge influence because I watched that solo over and over again. So that's the Loose Tubes at number 6. Right, at number 5, I have this masterpiece of jazz fusion, big band, 70s jazz rock. And it's The Only Chrome Waterfall Orchestra by Mike Gibbs. Mike Gibbs was the arranger of 70s jazz fusion. He's the guy that did the arrangements for Apocalypse by the Mahavishnu Orchestra. An incredible musician, and he had an incredible link to those sort of 70s jazz rock musicians that I love so much. He's made some great albums, but this is a real masterpiece here. The lineup is Charlie Mariano on alto saxophone, soprano saxophone. We got the great Philip Catherine on guitar, Steve Swallow on bass, Bob Mosley on drums, Joma Santos on percussion, and Mike Gibbs on keyboards. Then a huge band with Kenny Wheeler, Kenny Lowther. I'm just reading that. Tony Coe's on here, who I think he passed away quite recently, I think. Alan Skidmore's on here, Duncan Lamont. A lot of British musicians, actually. And it's on the Bronze record label, which is the same label that I believe Motorhead were on. This is I didn't know that. So my favourite tune on here is a tune called Nai Ram by Philip Catherine. It's one of the most beautiful melodies ever written. Philip Catherine wrote this tune. A few years later, the great Robert Wyatt on his album Sleep took that composition, he reversed the Nairam and he created the name Marianne and put lyrics to it, and that is one of my favourite songs of all time. And the original is here. Well, actually not, because I think Philip Catherine performed it on an earlier solo album, then it was brought in for this. But this is a really incredible album. If you're a jazz fusion fan in a big band, this is essential. Right, so we're at number 4 now. Right, so I've cheated here because I could have had a number of albums here, but I knew this guy would have to be on the list. And I've gone for a different album. I was going to pick a different drummer by Buddy Rich, which had the alternative title Superstar. If you go back through my videos, I've brought this out a few times and I've talked about it a few times. I absolutely love that album. But there's another album that I absolutely love, and I'm going to put this in the list here. And it's from 1975, and it's called Big Band Machine. And this is the point where Buddy Rich, who was so important for keeping big band music alive, and managed to run a big band quite successfully through the jazz fusion period. And he changed the name of his band to the Big Band Machine, and he brought an album out called the Big Band Machine 75. I have this weird Italian version of it, which doesn't even give you the title of the album. This is a wild fusion album. Yes, Buddy Rich could play fusion. If you go and check out a different drummer or this is some wild fusion on here. He does 3 Day Sucker. There's a Tommy medley that's like 10 minutes long. He does On Broadway, Piece of Dreams, Ease On Down the Road, the Jacksons tune, and then he finishes off with the classic West Side Story medley 1975. This is worth getting for Steve Marcus's incredible soprano saxophone solo through a wah-wah pedal that he does on 3 Day Sucker. This is some burning heavy jazz fusion. Check these 70s albums out. When we talk about jazz fusion, we never talk about Buddy Rich. And there's this idea that Buddy Rich was like one of the greatest drummers that have ever lived. People think he was the greatest. And he was a great big band drummer. And he had a disdain for rock music. But it's not evidence on these albums. He's played funky stuff, rock stuff. I mean, we've got The Who on here. He's doing the Tommy medley. And check him out playing drums. He's a funky drummer. This is an incredible album. Right, so what have I got at number 4? Right, at number 4 I have The Grand Wazoo by Frank Zappa. Right, now I know for big band fans I am pushing the definition a lot here, but this is an out and out jazz album and it's a big band. This is a big band jazz album, right? There's the lineup, you can see the lineup there. We've got George Duke on here, the incredible Sal Marquez on trumpet. This is just a masterpiece, and when I've done my Zappa top 10s and I've talked about Zappa elsewhere, I haven't really mentioned the Grand Wazoo, and people are like, don't you like the Grand Wazoo? I absolutely love the Grand Wazoo. I also love Waka Jawaka. This is the period that comes after that Flo and Eddie period of Frank Zappa's career. I wasn't keen on Flo and Eddie. That's my least favourite bit of the Zappa era. And but if you listen to 200 Motels, which is a real masterpiece, you can hear Zappa bringing this orchestral element into his music, which he'd done before. He did it on Lumpy Gravy. But here, he really is exploring a big band. This big band jazz he's exploring here. Now, recently, I interviewed the now sadly departed Ralph Humphrey, and I quizzed him on how much Don Ellis had influenced Frank Zappa. And he said that he couldn't think of any influence, and Zappa never mentioned him, although Don Ellis does appear on Freak Out. I feel that this owes a lot to Don Ellis, which is an incredible album with some incredible soloing on. The highlight for me is Eat That Question, that starts off with George Duke's incredible, free, sort of open piano solo, and then he just kicks in with this heavy groove. There's some incredible soloing on there, and then the big band element comes together, but when it comes together it's like a Roman anthem, a fanfare that seems to go back to ancient civilizations. It's quite incredible. So that's what I've got at number 4, is the Grand Wazoo. At number 3 I have an album which I haven't got here, I couldn't find it in my collection, and it is Soaring by the aforementioned Don Ellis Orchestra. I said over and over again that Don Ellis, a bit like Stan Kenton, and he sort of came out of the Stan Kenton school, Don Ellis did. Don Ellis is another musician that does not get the credit. He's one of the pioneers of jazz rock fusion. His 1968 album Electric Bath was an absolute masterpiece. It's probably the first masterpiece of the jazz fusion genre. And in there he pulls together sort of classical arrangements into a big band jazz context. He pulls in modality, microtonal playing, he pulls in Indian influences, odd time influences, electronics, psychedelia. A lot of the things that the Mahavishnu Orchestra got known for bringing together, Don Ellis had already brought that together. The Electric Bath is an absolute masterpiece, and I nearly put it here. But it's a rambling psychedelic album. It's absolutely incredible. By 1973, that band, with Ralph Humphrey on drums, had really coalesced into something really tight, and Soaring is absolutely an incredible album. The opening track on there is Whiplash, which was then grabbed for the film Whiplash. And when I was thinking about this list, I started to think about that album, and I started to think about Soaring and how nobody talks about that album. They don't mention Whiplash. That track has really gained its fame from the film, and the drummer on there is Ralph Humphrey. Nobody really says this, that Ralph Humphrey is the original Whiplash drummer. So if you want to know more about this, go and check out my Ralph Humphrey interview. It's really, really interesting. Sorry, I'm getting pestered now. You don't know what it's like being a YouTuber. You come in here and you try and do these things and you get pestered. You get pestered by your mum, you get pestered by your daughter, right? So, where was I? Don Ellis, Soaring. This album, again, is a forgotten fusion classic, and it's a forgotten big band classic as far as I'm concerned. But on there is some of the greatest big band jazz writing of all time. So I'm going to move on to number, that was number 3, so we're number 2 now. Right, I wanted to put some Gil Evans on here. I didn't know what to put. And I didn't want to put too much jazz fusion on there, but there's 2 albums by him from the 70s that I absolutely love. One is where he plays the music of Jimi Hendrix, and you get to hear Purple Haze plays on a tuba. And the other is one called There Comes a Time, which has got Tony Williams on drums and vocals. It's an incredible album. Svengali's great. But I think we have to go back to those classic Miles Davis albums. Birth of the Cool could be on this list. That's one of the most important big band jazz albums in history, changed the face of big band. But I think the one I'm going to go for is this one. You could argue this is the first fusion album, and Miles goes and grabs those Spanish influences and brings them into the music, and he combines it with a modal approach. And then Gil Evans' incredible post Duke Ellington arrangements, you know, where he'll take this harmony and chords and he'll voice it in a way which is absolutely unique. Gil Evans is probably after Duke Ellington and possibly one of the great people behind big band jazz. Absolutely incredible. So my favourite track on here is The Pan Piper, which is absolutely beautiful. It shows Miles Davis in that really subtle approach, which is contrast to some of the things like Bitches Brew, which he did later. Right, so I've got at number 1 a combined number 1, because I didn't know which of these guys to choose. I knew these 2 would go at the top of the list, and then I thought, which one am I going to put on top? And I thought, I don't know which one to go for. So joint number 1 to start off with is, of course, Count Basie. Anybody who knows their Basie would say that Atomic Mr. Basie is the album to get. That's his greatest album. I would probably go for April in Paris, which is one I grew up with listening a lot too. So those are the albums that I would put on a more objective list. But for me personally, it would be these 2. Let's get them in the right order. Milt Jackson, Count Basie, Volume 1, and Milt Jackson and Count Basie, Volume 2. I've just done a video on Milt Jackson, the Modern Jazz Quartet. He's one of my favourite musicians, one of my favourite soloists. And he really swings. And Count Basie really swings. And to put them together is just a magical combination of sound, right? This album was recorded on the Pablo label, which was a label that sort of signed up a lot of sort of older jazz musicians in the 70s and recorded them really well. So if you go and listen to April in Paris, it's a great album. It sounds great, but it's in mono. You know, if you want to hear the power of the Basie band, then go and check this out. This is the album I grew up with. Count Basie is like the epitome of swing. He's the epitome of groove. Within the Count Basie band in the 1930s, we see the development of the rhythm section. Before these bands, a jazz group was cornet, trombone, banjo, and clarinet. That was what a jazz group was. We see the development with the Joe Jones, Freddie Green, Jimmy Blanton, rhythm section in the Basie band. We see the beginnings of sort of guitar, bass, and drums. We see Joe Jones move time from sort of the snare drum and the traps, the accoutrements that drummers would have, like coconuts and all this type of stuff, and he moved it onto the hi-hat. And we see the development of that rhythm section, rhythm and blues sounds, that then goes on to influence people like Louis Jordan and eventually Bill Haley and the whole rock and roll thing. It's all in Count Basie. And so this is why I couldn't put Count Basie at number 2. I had to put him at number 1, joint with, of course, the great, one of the most important musicians in history, and it is, of course, Duke Ellington. Now, on my greatest jazz albums of all time, where I was a bit more objective, I put Ellington at Newport as the greatest album. I'm going to cheat here with my number 1. This is the album I grew up listening to. This is the album that I know. This is the album I love, and it is a sort of greatest hits, I'm afraid. It's this one. It's called The Great Duke Ellington. And on here, we have Take the A Train, I Got It Bad, Perdido, Mood Indigo, Black and Tan Fantasy, The Twitch, Solitude, Doing Nothing Till You Hear From Me, The Mooch, Sophisticated Lady, and Trio Love Call. It's got everything you want on this album. It doesn't say greatest hits, but I do feel like I've cheated. I know nothing about when this was made. It's got Sam Woodyard on drums, so that suggests the 1950s. We got Johnny Hodges, Paul Gonsalves. Yes, this is recorded in the 50s. It's absolutely brilliant. This is the one I grew up with. I'm sure if I did a bit of research, I'd find that this is actually another album under another name, but it could be a compilation. But with someone like Duke, how do you do him justice? What album do you go for? So that's my number one. And those are my favourites, 10, 11, 10 big band jazz albums. I hope you enjoyed this video. We've attracted more of a jazz audience to this channel. But proggers, and there'll be none watching at this point, but proggers, I will be coming back to the prog. We'll be doing a lot of jazz, and I wanted to do this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It's really great to talk about some artists I haven't talked about before. So if you like what I do, then please like and subscribe. If you want to see the next video, click the notification bell. If you want to support me through these dark and troubled times, then go over to Patreon and give me some money every month so I can feed my kids and they don't have to come in scratching at the window saying, Dad, have you got any food? And I'm out here trying to do my videos and make a bit of money. Sorry about that. That was like begging, wasn't it? It was begging. I was begging you. And the thing is, you see, what's going on about my daughter wants to go somewhere, I've got to take her somewhere. You know what kids are like, she's sort of nagging at the door. And then my mom, she wants me to go over and see all real life is around, you know. And the thing is music just doesn't matter. It's real life that matters. What music does is make our life wonderful. It makes it enjoyable. It makes us reflect on the beauty of being alive. Always remember that. So don't get all grumpy and angry and start going on at me in the comments because there's no Woody Herman, right? Just sit back and enjoy it. And let's all celebrate it together. And if you like that, then you've come to the right place, because that's what I try and do. And I get so excited and I garble my words sometimes. But now I must leave you and attend to real life. And you all can go and do that too. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.